Welcome back to Wild Hearts and Old Times. I'm glad you're here with me again. Tonight's story takes us to the New Mexico territory in the mid-1880s, to a small river crossing where people learned to live quietly because the world around them did not make room for hesitation. It was a place shaped by labor, by illness, by unspoken rules that decided who belonged and who was merely tolerated. So let's begin. Margaret Rowan had learned, early on, that the world rewarded women who were easy to overlook. She lived near the edge of Mesa Verde Crossing, in a narrow cabin set back from the main road where the dust settled thick and the sound of wagons faded before reaching the door. The boards of the house had warped over time, bending inward as if the structure itself had grown tired of standing upright. Margaret knew every creak of the floor, every draft that slipped through the seams when the night cooled. She had learned to listen for small changes, because small changes often meant more work. Her mother lay in the back room, breath shallow and uneven. The illness had arrived quietly, the way many things did in that part of the territory, and it had settled in without asking permission. Some days were better than others. On the worst mornings, Margaret could hear the strain in her mother's chest before she even opened the door. She learned to read the sound of breathing the way other people read clocks. Her father was still there, in the technical sense of the word. He slept late, spoke little, and drank more than the household could afford. Margaret did not remember the moment he stopped being a source of comfort and became another responsibility, only that it had happened gradually enough that no one thought to stop it. She did not hate him. She simply adjusted around him. Margaret herself was easy to miss. She kept her shoulders slightly rounded, her gaze lowered in town, her movements efficient and unassuming. Her dresses were plain, worn thin at the elbows and hem, when she walked the main street of Mesa Verde Crossing. She did so with purpose, never lingering longer than necessary. What set her apart, though she tried not to let it, was her hair. It was the color of dried copper, a soft ginger shade that caught light even on overcast days. As a child, she had been told it was pretty. As she grew older, she learned that pretty could become a liability. She kept it braided tightly or tucked beneath a scarf, smoothing it down until it behaved, in a town that noticed everything it disapproved of. Standing out felt unsafe. Margaret did not think of herself as unhappy. She thought of herself as practical. The creek behind the cabin was one of the few places where she allowed herself to breathe more deeply. It was not beautiful in the way people wrote about beauty. The water ran shallow in places, pooling around stones polished smooth by years of movement. Cottonwood trees leaned over the bank, their leaves whispering even when the air was still. Margaret went there to wash clothes, to collect water, to stand where the sound of moving current dulled the noise inside her head. It was there that she began to notice him. He appeared without announcement, always at a distance. Sometimes he was there when she arrived. Sometimes he passed through while she worked. He never crossed directly into her path. He did not greet her. He did not pretend not to see her either. His presence felt deliberate in a way that was difficult to define. She noticed how he moved measured, economical, as though every step had been chosen ahead of time. He kept to the edges of shared spaces, never claiming more ground than necessary. When he worked near the water, he did so with an ease that suggested long familiarity with the land. There was nothing performative about him. He did not seek to be understood. Margaret told herself she watched him only because he was different, because novelty was rare and curiosity natural. Yet she became aware of his absence when he did not appear, of the way the creek felt altered when he was not somewhere nearby. Mesa Verde Crossing was a town that survived on arrangements rather than agreements. There were rules, written and unwritten, but most people understood that enforcement depended on convenience. If someone caused trouble, the town found a way to push back. If they did not, the town learned to look the other way. This was how order was maintained, not through fairness, but through fatigue and habit. The Apache man existed because he fit within that narrow tolerance. Those who paid attention knew he carried a temporary pass, issued through a merchant who moved goods along the river routes west of the valley. The document allowed him to travel between designated points, to work when hired, and to trade under supervision. It did not grant residency. It did not promise protection. It simply explained why no one had yet run him off. He came into town only when necessary. Some watched him with open suspicion. Others pretended he was not there at all. A few, usually those with their own reasons for avoiding attention, regarded him with quiet calculation. No one greeted him by name or asked where he stayed when he was not visible. The sheriff knew of him. So did Edgar Whitlock. Whitlock, in particular, disliked uncertainties. He preferred people who could be accounted for, recorded, and leveraged. The Apache man resisted all three. Still, Whitlock tolerated his presence, as the town did, because there was no immediate gain in confrontation. The man worked. He paid when required. He did not interfere with Whitlock's interests. Margaret Rowan encountered him there more often than she did anywhere else. She did not seek him out, nor did she alter her habits to avoid him. Their paths crossed because the creek served them both. When she worked near the water, he was sometimes already there. At other times, he arrived and departed without drawing attention to himself. When their presence overlapped, he kept his distance. He worked as though she were simply another fact of the landscape, neither obstacle nor invitation. Margaret noticed how others reacted when they saw him near the river. A few men slowed their horses, watching with narrowed eyes. Some paused at a distance, as if deciding whether to say something, then chose not to. The balance held because it was easier to let it hold than to disrupt it. Neither of them understood, yet, that this careful coexistence, this quiet awareness without expectation, was already laying the groundwork for something that would soon demand more than distance and restraint could provide. The creek was already busy when Margaret arrived that morning. Water moved steadily around stones worn smooth by years of passing seasons. Cottonwood branches stretched low over the bank, their leaves catching the light and scattering it across the surface in shifting patterns. The air carried the faint scent of damp earth and crushed grass, a smell that lingered on her hands long after she left. She had not expected to see him there, or at least that's what she told herself. Nantan stood near the bend where the bank dipped gently into the water, working with his back angled away from her. He had chosen a place that left space on either side, as though anticipating that someone else might need room. Margaret paused at the edge of the path, taking in the distance between them, then stepped forward. The creek belonged to no one. She reminded herself of that as she set down her basket. They did not acknowledge one another. Margaret knelt closer to the water, sleeves rolled, attention fixed on the cloth beneath her hands. She worked methodically, letting the familiar rhythm settle her breathing. The sound of the current filled the space between them, steady enough to dull the sharper noises of thought. Upstream, Nantan continued what he had been doing before she arrived. He moved with care, adjusting his footing before each step, testing the ground rather than assuming it would hold. When he reached for his tools, he placed them deliberately on a flat stone instead of the dirt. At one point, Margaret became aware of a pause. She looked up briefly and saw him straighten, scanning the area as two riders approached along the opposite bank. They did not slow, but their presence shifted the air all the same. Nantan stepped back, creating more distance than the situation required. He turned his body slightly away from Margaret's position, placing himself between her and nothing in particular. Then, again, he set a small knife down on the stone. He did not look toward her when he did it. He resumed his work as though nothing had changed. Margaret returned her attention to the cloth in her hands. She did not know why the gesture registered so clearly. It was not that dramatic, and no one else nearby seemed to notice. And yet it remained present in her awareness. Quiet, but insistent, like a thought that refused to settle into the background. They continued like that for some time, sharing the space without interaction. Margaret finished one piece of laundry and moved to the next. The cold water numbed her fingers, but she did not mind. It gave her something immediate to focus on. The moment stretched, unhurried, without demand. She became aware, slowly, of what was missing. There was no pressure to speak. The space held steady, unchanged by her being in it. When she shifted position, Nantan adjusted his stance as well, subtly, ensuring that the distance between them remained consistent. He accounted for her movement and continued on. Margaret realized she had not tightened her shoulders the way she usually did around unfamiliar men. Her posture remained loose, her breathing even. The absence of tension surprised her more than its presence ever had. Eventually, she gathered the finished laundry and wrung out the excess water. As she stood, her boots slipped slightly on the damp ground. It was nothing more than a brief loss of balance, easily corrected. But she froze for a fraction of a second, aware of how close the water was. Nantan shifted his weight, ready to move, then stopped. He did not reach for her. He did not step closer. He waited. Margaret steadied herself and nodded once, more to the moment than to him. The hesitation passed. She felt no embarrassment, no relief, only a heightened awareness of how carefully the moment had been handled. "Thank you," she said. The words quiet, almost unnecessary. He inclined his head in acknowledgement. The bank's slick here in the mornings. That was all. The exchange settled back into silence as naturally as it had arisen. Margaret lifted her basket and turned toward the path that led home. As she stepped away from the creek, she felt the space close behind her, unchanged by her departure. She did not look back as she walked. The details of the morning remained with her: the water, the light, the deliberate way Nantan had moved within shared ground. None of it formed a conclusion. There was no clarity waiting to be claimed, only an awareness, newly present and not yet understood. Margaret carried it with her, unsettled but intact, knowing only that something in her sense of the world had shifted slightly out of alignment and that it would not be easily dismissed. Margaret noticed the bundle when she stepped outside to draw water. It rested near the fence post, placed where it would not be missed but not made obvious either. She paused, studying it from where she stood, measuring the space around her before moving closer. The yard was still, the air carrying only the low sound of wind passing through dry grass. The bundle was small, wrapped in cloth and tied with a thin strip of bark. Inside were seeds she recognized immediately, beans and greens suited to land that asked more than it gave. They were the kind of seeds people saved when they did not have many to spare. Margaret carried them into the house and set them on the table near the window. She did not open them again right away. The day pressed on, pulling her back into its familiar rhythm, tending the stove, checking on her mother, washing what needed washing. Still, her attention returned to the table more often than she intended. Seeds carried weight beyond what they were. She knew that. They suggested future work, uncertain yield, and the quiet risk of hoping for something that might not come. That evening, she stood at the edge of the garden plot behind the house. The soil there was thin, compacted by seasons of use. She imagined breaking it open, pressing the seeds into the ground, waiting. The thought unsettled her. She chose not to plant them the following morning. She found a stack of firewood arranged neatly against the cabin wall. Each piece had been split with care, sized for her stove rather than for speed. The house warmed more quickly that day, and her mother rested with fewer interruptions. Margaret did not mention the offerings to anyone. When she passed through town later, she sensed the shift in attention around her, the subtle recalibration of how others measured her presence. She kept her scarf tight around her hair and her eyes on the road ahead. That afternoon, she returned to the house with the seeds still untouched. They remained on the shelf above the table, neither accepted nor refused, holding their place in her life the way unanswered questions often do. Quietly and with persistence, Margaret had lived in Mesa Verde Crossing long enough to recognize when she was being discussed rather than addressed. It showed in the way voices softened as she approached, then resumed with altered tones once she passed. A conversation paused in the store just long enough to acknowledge her presence without including it. People adjusted their positions on the boardwalk, making room without inviting her into it. Nothing overt enough to confront. Nothing she could name without sounding defensive. She kept her routines tight. Her scarf stayed drawn low, the ginger of her hair hidden as carefully as ever. She finished her errands quickly and left town before the sun climbed too high. Still, the feeling followed her home, settling in the quiet corners of the house where worry already lived. Her mother's condition worsened as the days passed. The cough that had once come and gone began to linger, pulling at her breath and leaving her exhausted. Margaret brewed what remedies she could, measured water carefully, kept the room warm. None of it was enough. She went to the doctor on a morning when the sky hung low and gray, her resolve brittle but intact. The office smelled of old tobacco and liniment. She explained the symptoms plainly, without embellishment, without begging. The doctor listened with half his attention and then shook his head. He spoke of prior visits, of unpaid accounts, of limits he could not cross without compensation. Margaret offered to work, to repay in time, if not in coin. He declined with practiced politeness, already turning back to his ledger, outside. The street felt louder than before. Margaret walked past the familiar buildings, the familiar faces, and understood that help was no longer something she could assume would be offered. It would have to be purchased, and the cost was more than she had. By the time she returned home, the whispers had reached her ears directly. Someone had mentioned the creek. Someone else had mentioned the Apache man. The words were not cruel on their own, but the tone carried accusation, as though association itself were a transgression. Margaret did not correct them. She did not confirm them either. That night, She sat beside her mother's bed, listening to the uneven rhythm of her breathing. The house felt smaller than it had before, its walls closing in around the narrow set of choices left to her. Margaret had learned to endure many things quietly. Judgment was one of them. Illness was another. But as the town's doors closed one by one, she understood a harder truth. Endurance alone would not save her mother. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider options she had avoided until now, paths that came with their own costs and consequences she could not yet fully see. The whispers followed her into the dark, and with them came the knowledge that doing nothing was no longer a neutral choice. Edgar Whitlock did not believe himself to be a cruel man. He told himself this often, usually in moments when his authority went unquestioned and his accounts balanced as they should. Mesa Verde Crossing had not been kind to him in his early years. He arrived with little more than a team worn thin by distance and a willingness to outlast men who expected the land to break him first. It did not. Instead, it taught him what leverage looked like. Whitlock learned early that mercy invited dependency, and dependency bred resentment, order. On the other hand, kept people predictable. Predictability kept things running. His house stood apart from the rest of the town, larger and better maintained than most. Its porch elevated just enough to suggest separation without isolation. Those who worked for him entered through the side. Those who owed him came through the front. Margaret stood at the edge of that porch longer than she meant to. The decision to come had not formed all at once. It had assembled itself quietly, piece by piece, as options fell away. By the time she reached Whitlock's gate, the choice felt less like a decision and more like the last path left open. Whitlock saw her from the window before she knocked. He took a moment before answering, straightening his coat, arranging his expression into one he knew served him well. When he opened the door, his gaze assessed rather than welcomed. "Miss Rowan," he said, recognition evident but not warm. "I was wondering when you might come by." Margaret held her hands together to keep them from trembling. "I heard you were looking for help." "I'm always looking for people who can work," he replied. "The question is whether they understand the terms." She nodded once. "I can work." Whitlock stepped aside to let her in. The movement practiced, measured, inside. The house was orderly to the point of severity. Every surface had its place. Every object suggested ownership. He explained the arrangement plainly. Long hours, no advance pay. Compensation issued at his discretion. Contingent on performance and duration. Leaving before he deemed the work complete meant forfeiture of wages. Margaret listened without interruption. "You're free to refuse," Whitlock said, his tone even. "But I don't make exceptions." "I understand," she said. Whitlock studied her for a moment longer, as though weighing something beyond the words exchanged. He had seen desperation before. He recognized its shape, the way it narrowed a person's vision until only survival remained. "Good," he said at last. "Then we won't have misunderstandings." Margaret began work the next morning. The tasks were not difficult in isolation: cleaning, carrying, scrubbing. What wore her down was the accumulation, the way each completed task gave way immediately to another. Breaks were brief, meals were sparse. The housekeeper spoke to her sharply, enforcing standards Whitlock had set but did not need to repeat. Whitlock observed from a distance. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. His control came from structure, from the quiet understanding that every moment of Margaret's labor was being tallied somewhere she could not see. When she faltered, he reminded her of the terms. When she persisted, he noted it without comment. To Whitlock, this was fairness. People who worked hard were rewarded. People who failed did not. The system, he believed, spoke for itself. Margaret said little during her first days. She focused on completing what was asked of her, conserving energy where she could. At night, she returned to the small room under the eaves assigned to her, her muscles aching in ways she had not known before. She thought of her mother often. That, more than exhaustion, kept her from leaving. Whitlock noticed her persistence and approved of it. In his mind, she was proving herself. What he did not consider was the cost at which that proof was being given, or what it meant to demand endurance without offering dignity in return. For Edgar Whitlock, the world had taught a single lesson: power protected those who claimed it. He did not see himself as the villain of anyone's story. He saw himself as the man who had learned how things worked and refused to be crushed by them again. Margaret worked on under his roof, unaware that the choice she had made would soon draw the attention of someone who understood a different kind of strength, and who would not accept Whitlock's definition of fairness as the final word. Nantan sensed Margaret's absence at the creek before he heard her name spoken anywhere else. The bend had returned to its usual rhythm. Water moved on. Light shifted across the cottonwoods. And the work he finished there took no longer than it ever had. Yet something in the space felt unfinished, as though a familiar presence had been removed without explanation. He took note of it and carried on. The explanation came later, in town. Two men lingered near the hitching post outside the store, talking without concern for who might overhear. Whitlock had taken on new help, one said. A woman from the far edge of the settlement, Rowan's daughter. Someone remarked that the work would grind her down quickly, and that Whitlock would count it no loss either way. Nantan continued past them, his business completed, the sound of their voices fading behind him. By the time he reached the river again, the day had cooled into evening. He sat longer than usual, watching the current slip past, stones worn smooth by time and pressure. Men like Whitlock were not unfamiliar to him. They appeared wherever rules could be shaped into advantage and hardship could be turned into leverage. They spoke of order and fairness, but only within systems they controlled. Nantan understood that kind of power. He also understood what it cost to challenge it. The decision did not take shape all at once. By morning, however, the path forward had narrowed enough to make delay its own kind of choice. He gathered what he would bring carefully. The bundle held what remained after years of trading, saving, and choosing what to keep. Pelts prepared with patience. A small amount of silver meant for the months when the land offered little. A few objects that carried memory rather than utility, kept because letting them go once would mean losing them entirely. He left behind what defined him. The ride to Whitlock's house was steady, neither rushed nor hesitant. The porch loomed ahead, elevated and orderly, a reflection of the man who claimed it. Whitlock received him with measured interest. The exchange unfolded without raised voices or unnecessary words. Whitlock examined what was offered, calculating value with the ease of long practice. He spoke of terms and precedent. Nantan answered only when needed, stating his purpose plainly. "She's finished here," Whitlock said at last. More statement than question. "She leaves today," Nantan replied. Whitlock considered this, then nodded. The bundle was taken inside. A door opened. Margaret appeared moments later. Her posture was stiff with fatigue, her hands marked by work that had not yet faded from her skin. She looked from Whitlock to Nanton, understanding arriving in fragments rather than all at once. Whitlock dismissed her with a gesture. "Your work here is done." Margaret stepped forward, stopping beside Nanton. She searched his face, waiting for words that did not come. He met her gaze briefly, then turned toward the road, leaving the choice of following to her. She followed. They rode away from Whitlock's property in silence. The distance between the house and the road felt longer than it had on the way in. Margaret's thoughts pressed forward without settling, shaped by relief and the heavier awareness that freedom rarely arrived without cost. Nanton felt the absence of what he had given up settle into place. What he carried now was lighter in weight and heavier in consequence. The attention he had avoided for years would find him soon enough. As the town fell behind them, the reality of the choice became clear. What he had done could not be undone, and it would not pass unnoticed. The cost had been accepted, and whatever followed would have to be faced without illusion. The road ahead lay open, but it no longer promised anonymity. Nanton guided the horse along the longer route, skirting the edges of the settlement where the land opened into rougher ground. Margaret did not question the choice. She watched the town recede behind them, its structures shrinking into a shape that no longer felt entirely solid. By the time they reached the cabin, the afternoon light had begun to thin. Margaret dismounted slowly, her legs stiff from days of work that had offered no rest. The house stood as it always had, narrow, weathered, patient. Her father was absent, whether by chance or avoidance. She could not say. The door opened easily beneath her hand. Inside, the air was cool and familiar. Nanton remained outside, tending to the horse and unloading what little he carried. Margaret watched him through the doorway, noticing the absence before she understood it. The bundle he had brought to Whitlock was gone, along with the quiet weight it must have carried in his life. "You didn't have to stay," she said finally. "I will for now," he replied. That was all he offered. In the days that followed, the consequences began to surface. When Nanton passed through town again, conversation shifted in his presence. Some people watched him more closely than before. Others avoided his gaze entirely. The sheriff acknowledged him with a nod that held no warmth but no challenge either. Whitlock did not appear. Work came slowly. A rancher asked for help repairing a fence, careful in his manner, as though unsure which rules applied now. Another man requested assistance hauling supplies, keeping his distance while accepting the labor without comment. No one spoke of what had changed. They behaved as if it were temporary, something that might correct itself if left unexamined. Margaret noticed how Nanton responded. He did the work offered. He accepted payment without negotiation. He did not attempt to explain himself or adjust his behavior to ease discomfort. His presence remained steady, neither withdrawn nor assertive, at home. Margaret settled back into routines that felt both familiar and altered. Her mother's condition had not improved, but the house no longer felt as though it were closing in on itself. Margaret brewed what remedies she could and kept the room warm. At night, she listened to her mother's breathing and measured the hours by its rhythm. She did not ask Nanton what he had given up. The absence spoke clearly enough. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal, Margaret looked at him across the small table. She searched for something to say that would acknowledge the weight between them without pretending it could be resolved by words. Instead, she asked, "Will this make things harder for you?" He considered the question before answering. "Some days." She nodded. The answer did not surprise her. Outside, the town continued on, adjusting its boundaries in small, uncertain ways. Acceptance did not arrive, but neither did open hostility. What remained was a narrow space carved by consistency and time. Nantan moved within that space with care. Margaret watched and learned. What he had paid could not be reclaimed. What he had kept, his restraint. His sense of measure remained intact, and in that balance, uneasy and unresolved, a different kind of stability began to take shape. The seeds remained where Margaret had left them, untouched on the shelf above the table. Days unfolded without ceremony, shaped more by routine than resolution. Nantan came and went with the daylight, taking work where it was offered and returning before the house settled fully into night. Margaret resumed the rhythm she knew, tending the fire, changing linens, measuring her mother's breath by sound rather than sight. What changed was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Nantan began bringing things that eased the strain on the house. Firewood appeared stacked close to the door, splits smaller than most men would bother with, suited for quick, controlled heat. He carried water from the creek when Margaret's arms had already reached their limit. Once, he returned with a bundle of herbs gathered from higher ground, explaining quietly which could ease the tightness in the chest and which should be used sparingly. Margaret followed his instructions carefully. Her mother's illness did not disappear, but it loosened its hold. The coughing fits shortened. Rest came in longer stretches. Margaret noticed the difference most in the mornings, when her mother woke without the same urgency for air. One afternoon, as Margaret adjusted the blanket at her mother's shoulders, the older woman's eyes opened fully. "There's a man helping you," she said, her voice thin but steady. Margaret hesitated. "Yes." Her mother studied her face for a moment, then nodded, as though confirming something she had already suspected. "He works quietly." Margaret pressed the cloth back to her mother's brow. "So do I." That evening, after the house had settled, Margaret took the seeds from the shelf. She stepped outside, the air cool against her skin, carrying the scent of cottonwood leaves and damp soil. The garden plot behind the house showed the wear of years without rest. She knelt and loosened the earth slowly, careful not to rush the work. When she pressed the seeds into the ground, she spaced them as she had been taught long ago, mindful of how much the soil could give. Nantan stood nearby, mending a length of rope. He did not approach or comment. When she finished covering the seeds, she sat back on her heels. "They may not take," she said. "They'll have what they need," he replied, in the days that followed. Margaret tended the plot when she could. Nantan carried water for the garden along with the water for the house, setting the buckets down where she could reach them easily. He repaired a loose shutter that had let in too much cold at night and reinforced the stovepipe before the next wind came through. Inside, Margaret's mother grew stronger in small, measurable ways. She asked for food. She sat up longer. Once, she insisted on washing her own hands, gripping the basin's edge while Margaret stood close. One evening, as the light softened, Margaret noticed the first thin green shoots breaking through the soil. She did not announce it. She watered the ground and returned to the house. where her mother slept more easily than she had in weeks. The town remained uncertain. Work remained inconsistent. Illness had not vanished. Yet something held. Nantan's presence had become part of the labor that sustained the house, not as a solution, but as a steady contribution. Margaret had chosen where to place her effort and who to accept help from. The seeds grew at their own pace. Her mother's strength followed its own course, and the life taking shape around them did so without promise or spectacle. It was not a rescue. It was care, repeated until it mattered. The season turned. Cooler mornings arrived first, followed by evenings that pressed closer around the house. Margaret adjusted as she always had, layering blankets, tending the fire with more care, listening for changes in her mother's breathing before sleep fully claimed the room. The illness remained, but it no longer ruled every hour. On better days, her mother sat near the window and watched the narrow garden plot where green had begun to take hold. The plants grew unevenly. Some stems stood firm, others struggled. Margaret tended them all, learning again that effort could prepare the ground but never command the outcome. Nantan continued as he had from the beginning. He worked where work was offered and returned before dusk. In town, people measured their words more carefully now. Some greeted him with guarded courtesy. Others kept their distance. The sheriff acknowledged him without warmth or challenge. Life adjusted, not through apology, but through repetition. Edgar Whitlock did not adjust as easily. His absence lingered at first, then returned in fragments. Word moved through Mesa Verde Crossing in the way it always did, unevenly, carried by errands and chance encounters. Whitlock's accounts had drawn attention. Men who had worked for him spoke quietly of withheld wages in terms that shifted without record. A ledger was requested. Then another. The order Whitlock relied upon had required silence to function. Once, that silence thinned. Scrutiny followed. He was not arrested. There was no spectacle to mark his decline. Instead, the town did what it did best when certainty faltered. Contracts dried up. Workers chose other houses. Merchants asked for payment in advance. His porch, once busy with transactions, stood empty more often than not. Whitlock remained in his house, still upright, still convinced of his reasoning. He told himself the town had grown ungrateful, that standards had softened. What unsettled him most was not loss of income, but loss of control. Predictability slipped from his grasp, replaced by a slow erosion he could neither confront nor command. Margaret learned of this gradually. A neighbor mentioned it while setting down a basket of apples. Another time, the doctor spoke of reviewing his own practices, careful to keep his tone neutral. Nothing was said directly about Whitlock, yet his name carried less weight each time it surfaced. Inside the house, Margaret's mother took her first steps outside in weeks, leaning on the doorframe while Margaret stood close. She watched the garden quietly, her gaze settling on the uneven rows. "You planted carefully," she said. Margaret nodded. "I planted what I could." That evening, Margaret and Nantan sat on the porch, the air cool with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The space between them felt settled, shaped by shared labor rather than declaration. Neither spoke of what had been lost or of what had shifted in town. Margaret understood now that endurance alone had never been the measure of her strength. Choice was. So was discernment. She had learned when to persist. and when to refuse terms that demanded too much of her life. Nantan remained beside her, unchanged in the ways that mattered. He had not reclaimed what he gave up, nor sought recognition for it. His dignity had survived scrutiny, not because it was defended, but because it was practiced daily. When Margaret rose to go inside, he rose with her. The future did not ask for naming yet. The garden would require continued care. Illness would continue to test patience. The town would continue to watch, recalibrating its judgments as towns always did. Edgar Whitlock still lived in Mesa Verde Crossing. He simply no longer decided how it worked. Margaret stepped into the house with the knowledge that justice did not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrived as limitation, as influence withdrawn, as power rendered smaller than it once claimed to be. Outside, the garden rested under the cooling sky. It did not promise abundance. It promised something steadier, something worth tending. As I was working on this story, I had a question in mind. This is different from how I think I would write my stories. There wasn't much idea of dialogues or anything dramatic details popped up in my head. I was thinking about how people can be attracted to someone they barely know, about how someone can catch our attention in such a subtle way, make us observe their even smallest actions. Is it some kind of magnetic attraction or simply a fleeting interest? Is it a call we should answer or ignore? So I found myself sinking a little too deep in the scene by the creek, and the observation, which could be boring, but I would feel incomplete if I skipped. If you're still listening until this moment, I want to say thank you. It's a wonderful sign to me that my words still can reach souls that I thought may not exist. Thank you.